Hey everybody, how you doing? It's Alan out in Vancouver, and I'm here with my special guest for the day. This is Sifu Mark, that runs London Wing Chun Academy out in London, England. Is that correct?
That's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for the intro, Adam.
And thanks for coming out and hanging out with us today. There's a lot of people that want to hear your voice, so we're excited to hear your story.
No, that's great. Thanks for inviting me. I'm honoured really to share my story and talk about what we do here in London. So I'm sure it'll be fun for everybody.
So let's just start off. Tell us, for somebody that's never heard about you before, that doesn't know your voice or your name, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, where you're from, what you do, like what your life's a little bit about.
Right. Well, I'm a professional martial artist, which is a little bit different to the run-of-the-mill guys in the sense that I teach for a living. I run a full-time school. We probably have one of the biggest Wing Chun academies in London. And with that in mind, I've been doing Wing Chun now for 32 years, but my whole adult life has been devoted to training and teaching Wing Chun. So I started when I was about 15 or 16 years of age, learning Wing Chun. And by the time I was 18, I was an apprentice instructor. And by the time I was 20, I was a professional instructor, so making a living, which I try to explain to most people. The distinction is that, I do this day in, day out. I don't have a daytime job. So when everybody's sitting at their desk working, I'm essentially training, or nowadays in my stage of my career, doing a lot of paperwork and
Absolutely.
bookkeeping and student management and so on, which isn't the fun stuff that everybody wants to know about. But hey, generally it's trying to squeeze in my own training and life as well with that. So generally, it's been an honor, and I've really enjoyed what I do. I've been blessed, really. My philosophy of teaching is to try to keep things as simple as possible, and with that, I try to simplify the concepts and the ideas, and try to make it a little bit more real and tangible for most people. Because, for example, when guys come to my academy, the first thing I usually say to them is, why do you want to train? And without a doubt, most people will often say it's because they want to get fit, or they want to learn how to defend themselves. And paramount, obviously, is they want to learn how to defend themselves. So I try to present the information in a way that people they understand. And if they can do that, then they appreciate it a lot more. And I think that's something that's missing in a lot of groups, or a lot of approaches. It's not necessarily criticism, but I think it's really important to try to engage people in what you're doing, and try to simplify it in a way that they can digest it, take it away, and apply it. And that's what I do, really. Or try to do.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I agree with you completely. Let's take that even a step back, and give us if you could, a little sense of, like, how did you even get started in something like Wing Chun, especially at such a young age?
Yeah, well, by coincidence, actually. This is a funny thing. And sometimes I say the art chose me rather than I chose the art.
Nice.
But it was coincidence. Originally I was a judoka. Before that, I used to practice judo, and I was doing that. I came from a judo family, so everybody trained in judo. So it was sort of the expected thing. And funny enough, I wanted to do more striking, and I had a friend who did Wing Chun. I didn't know it was Wing Chun, by the way. He just said, I train a Kung Fu style. And I knew Kung Fu consisted of a little bit of striking. And he said, we're having an open day. Do you want to come down and check it out and have a look? And I said, yeah, okay, great. So I went along, and I met my Sifu then, which is still my now Sifu now, Master James Sinclair. And, 32 years later, I'm still his student, which, for most people, that's a lot longer than most marriages, really. Think about it.
Good point. Yeah, agreed.
So, I went along. I didn't have any expectations. And I think that's probably the difference of why I've managed to sustain such a long career, because I didn't enter it with the expectation that I wanted to be so good, or I wanted to achieve this, or I wanted to achieve that. I went in with an open mind, but more so with a blank canvas, really. I didn't really have any thoughts or desires to be the next best thing, or even, obviously, I think as your career progresses, or as your training progresses, you do obviously look at other people and say, I'd like to be as good as them. But initially, that wasn't my desire. So, and I think that's the importance for longevity in training. Too many students, and too many of my students, spend too much time looking at everybody else and worrying about the end goal, and therefore, they end up not achieving it because they're too anxious about being as good as they can be. So, take the pressure off you. That's what I say to everybody. Take the pressure off yourself and just enjoy the journey. And, it'll be fun if you can.
Yeah, no, it's a really good mindset to have, because the less it's enough pressure to walk into a new school in a new environment where you don't know anybody. You're maybe kind of nervous. Like, I remember my first day when I first started training, I didn't know anyone, and I was the most out of shape. I was the fattest guy in my class, and it was nerve-wracking just to try to keep up. So obviously you picked up on that, I'm assuming, with your students when they were first new. You probably saw that there was some level of pressure on them. How do you get them to relax a little bit? Because that's a different dynamic. How do you get them to take that perspective that you just explained and try to keep that in mind as they first start off in your classes?
Well, bearing in mind, we don't put experienced students with new students or new starters. So if someone walks through my door, they won't go into a class full of experienced people, because obviously that's not only going to put them off, but it's going to put them in a little bit of stress and anxiety, because they're going to be quite anxious about being in a group full of people that know what they're doing. So, it's a lot easier to teach people of similar skill sets in the same environment. So new beginners generally will train together, and we keep them together, and it's a little bit easier, obviously. So that takes a little bit of pressure off of them because they're not so anxious. Having said that, even someone that walks through the door will look at a group of people and think, oh, they're all better than me. So I often have to take some time to explain to them that, it's mostly people have their own expectations that they're going to pick it up quite quickly. And the best analogy is to say to someone that, can you dance? And they'll say, well, no, or yes, whatever the answer is. But you'll say, well, how long did it take you? Or do you understand that it takes a lot of coordination to be able to dance? So if you can imagine learning to dance and learning a dance routine, but then having someone punching, kicking you at the same time.
Wow, that's talent.
Exactly, it's a lot of talent.
Jeez.
But it's also quite difficult to learn if you put it into that context. And people get that, they understand the analogy, because that's an analogy, obviously, and they understand that it's not a skill that's going to come. They're not going to do one lesson, two lessons, and suddenly be able to, fly through the air or do some magical work. So I do try to talk to people in a reasonable but realistic manner, and I think you only learn to do that over a period of time, and obviously confidence of working with people, because otherwise I don't know. I lead from the front, but I also get involved with my students rather than commanding them and telling them what they should do. I listen to them and I talk to them, and I try to sort of unpick what might be the barriers for them to learning a particular technique or learning a particular sequence. Because don't forget, we're teaching people ultimately how to defend themselves. So those scenarios sometimes can be quite difficult to deal with. And I really do believe, and it's one thing I do say a lot on our channel, is that psychology wins fights. And a lot of people, they're too hung up on which martial arts is the best martial art, and to me that's just complete nonsense, and it always has been. I think really what it boils down to is the individual practitioner, which we always say that. But how do you define what defines the individual practitioner being good at their art? Well, it's their psychology. It's their ability to deal with pressure, a high amount or intensity of pressure, and be able to respond to that pressure, in a way that they can produce the skills that they've been training. So it really does come down to individuals and not the style. And I always, I really always try to avoid those arguments, because I personally find it quite childish, because when you've been practicing martial arts for a long time, the first thing you understand or you see is that there's more similarities than dissimilarities in martial arts, and people are too hung up on the dissimilarities. They think, oh, that's what, and I get that. And the real reason why people do it is because of their world beliefs. If someone trains a martial art like I have for 32 years, then you put a lot of time, effort, and worldview into that, and your whole sort of psyche is wrapped up into your training. So as soon as something challenges that, you have this negative reaction. And I see that because I see it a lot on our YouTube channel. We get a lot of negative comments, and sometimes on videos that I actually, I don't put anything out that I actually think is bad, and I certainly don't teach anything online that I've never done or had any experience of doing. I'm not the type of person that will just put something out that I know nothing about, or because my teacher told me to do this and therefore I'm going to teach from that perspective. The one thing that I've learned, and I was always taught that by my own teacher actually, was to teach from your own experience. And he always said to me, look, when you go out there, you teach from your experience, you don't say what I said. And I've carried that through to today. And that is a good perspective to have. And I've passed that on to my teachers as well. My instructors, I tell them the same thing. You can only teach from experience. So, and unfortunately, I will say in the martial arts community, and almost certainly in the Wing Chun community, we have a lot of people that if you ask them a question, they'll say, for example, I have people coming to my school sometimes that have trained Wing Chun, and I'll say, why do you do X, Y, Z? And they'll say, because my teacher told me to do that. And then I'll say, okay, well, why did they tell you to do that? Because their teacher told them to do that. Okay, well, has anybody actually tried it to know if it really works?
Agreed. It almost seems obvious for us, right? It almost seems obvious, but it's rarely ever questioned.
It is, but because of the martial art mindset of you must never. I mean, I was teaching a seminar. I won't say what country it was, but I was teaching a seminar in a country some time ago because I teach in a lot of different countries.
Nice.
I'm very fortunate to do that. In fact, I was in New York and Philadelphia a couple of months ago, actually. So I'm quite often doing the roadshow globally, and I was in this specific country, and the Sifu who was hosting the seminar said to his students that you couldn't ask questions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'm, basically he took the tack that you can't question your teacher. And I'm the complete opposite. I encourage my guys to ask me as many questions as they can. Believe me, I've had all questions like, what happens if a ninja appears behind you in a puff of smoke? I've had every single question you could possibly ask. But I encourage it because it not only engages their brain, but it engages my brain as well. Because, if someone asks me a question and I don't know the answer, then A, it's a worry. And that's, to be honest with you, never happens. And B, I don't deserve to be teaching my class, because if I can't really address their basic questions or problems, then and that's really sometimes abuse of position or power, if you like, over people that you can quite often see in martial arts, really. So, it's sad, but that's the reason why I suppose I can articulate things quite well, because I encourage people to talk to me, in which case I talk to them back, and the information comes out. And, it's easier that way, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's kind of nice when you can be in a place where you and your students can have a two-way communication, because it's not just I find if it's just one way, it's 50-50 if they'll understand it, let alone absorb it, let alone remember it. And I've had this, maybe you can attest to this too, where, I've taught a few lessons in my Krav Maga program. And next, 2 months later, we review it again. And some of my students are like, yeah, I remember that. And then the other half were like, no, this is new for me. I don't think I've ever done this before. And I'm thinking in my head, wait a minute, we've done this 2 times already. And then that became my indication to realize, okay, I need to ask them more questions sometimes to get them to engage, because you're right. Some people that come from that other background of you can't question your instructor, when they carry that over, it's almost in one ear, out the other, generally speaking, of course, right? It's challenging. And as a teacher, you want them to absorb that.
And you want them to absorb it, and you also likewise want to test that ability. So asking you questions is a good sign, and especially practical, when you're training very practically. I mean, let's be honest. The martial arts community is divided between the esoteric, if you like, and the practical. And it is, in my mind, a little bit of a problem, but. Either way, you still need to ask questions, either side. If you're on the practical, you almost certainly, when you're looking at reality dimension, need to ask questions. And I don't ask people to doubt what I say, but I do ask them to quiz it and say, well, what ifs are acceptable? They really are. So, I think it's important.
I agree.
It really is.
One of my old instructors used to say, you can ask anything that's labeled in respect. Ask anything respectfully and the door is always open, right?
Yeah.
100%. So your angle is quite unique in the sense that you're taking, I guess you can call it a traditional martial art, and you're applying a common daily practical, you can call it like a no nonsense approach. What did you always train that way, or did one day you kind of stumble on this? Like, how did that evolve?
I suppose the ethos in the way that I was taught is I come from a traditional background, and I still train tradition. I still have that traditional mindset. Don't get me wrong, even though when you look at my work, it doesn't appear to be that. But I mean, if I roll it back before I got to the stage I'm at now, when I was taught Wing Chun, the idea was that we were taught it because Wing Chun is mostly a conceptual art. I think it's widely agreed in Wing Chun community that it's conceptual art.
What does that mean?
It's based on very simple. Conceptual. Well, it's based on simple ideas such as moving as efficiently as directly as possible, and that's a very simple concept that can be applied in many different situations. So we have sort of three tenets: moving efficiently, which is usually referred to as economy of motion; moving, which also involves moving directly, which therefore brings up the theory of the the center line theory. So moving to the center of the mass, or moving directly, which is towards the center. And then there's the idea of, because you're moving efficiently, how do you generate power? And that's the concept of short distance power. So those are sort of the three main tenets, which are concepts, they're theories. So the style itself is not so shape driven like a lot of older traditional Chinese styles. It's much more conceptual in its thinking. So if you take that, and you take those notions and you become much more less shape-based in terms of pattern recognition of having to look a certain way, but more strategy-based on, I'm faced with a situation, how do I deal with it? Then you've got something that crosses over to many different types of environments and many different situations. So, for example, if you were looking at the concept of moving efficiently and directly, well, that could apply to a sporting competition like an MMA match. It could apply to self-defense. It could apply to different environments within a self-defense context, such as being in a vehicle, someone's attacking you, being in, I'm just throwing this out there, being in a closed space. The idea is that it's a strategy, and the strategy is flexible. So that's how I teach now, but before I got to the stage where I'm at now, the way that I was trained in Wing Chun was that no matter what we did, it had to be cross-purpose. We had to be able to apply it in different situations, not to the degree that I am now with the way that I teach Wing Chun, especially on our YouTube channel, but more so in the fact that if I learned Wing Chun, we should be able to go out and spar with a boxer or train with a kickboxer or, go to a karate school and train with karate guys. It wasn't so sort of specific that, if you were learning to fight, you were learning to fight, and you would fight whoever was in front of you. So you couldn't be, well, I only do Wing Chun, so therefore I'm only going to do Chi Sao with one person. It doesn't work like that. So the ethos has always been there. It's always been planted. But now what I do is I'm taking it a little stage further and now say, okay, we've got these concepts. How do we take these concepts and make it much more multidimensional and much more applicable to different environments? And there could be a range of different hostile environments, which could even include weapons as well. So it's a stage further than it was, but it's still very much a martial art, and it's still very much a way of thinking. As I said, it's the strategy, and I think strategy is the most important thing to emphasize.
Yeah, that's huge. I find that over the years, I've had a chance to meet a handful of great instructors, and a lot of them come from that perspective of not just teaching a technique, but coming forward with a mindset, and that mindset getting established with a certain set of principles. The principles getting established with some technique, but the technique was more like a foundation. So if somebody broke off from it a little bit, just like how you said, it's got to work for the individual. So as long as it worked and it didn't deviate so much where it was like you couldn't even recognize what they were doing and elevated their risk of personal harm, then it was fine, right? And that's huge. I find that being able to let out the best of yourself through your training and having a teacher like you understand how to mold that, it's so crucial to becoming I guess you could say the best version of you, at least in or the best version of the individual in the martial arts industry community?
Oh, definitely, 100%. Look, I mean, the way that I look at it is that we owe it to the people that we teach. If someone walks through my door and they say, look, I want to learn how to defend myself, and I teach them something that, because I'm not really too into what I'm doing or whatever my motive is or lack of motivation is, and they go out and they try it and get hurt, then I'm responsible for that because I'm the person that taught them that information in the first place, and they trusted me to try to do that. So, the way that I look at it is it's not so shape driven, it's not so pattern driven, it's not about what you look like, it's about how effective you are. And how effective you are is defined by your strategy, and that again in turn depends on you as an individual, because I've got big guys, I've got small guys, I've got ladies, I've got, people of all different walks of life and ages and motivations and attitudes. You can't have a one-size-fits-all for everybody. And that's why I think a strategy is much more effective. Because if you teach them a strategy and you say, in this scenario, this is what you have to achieve and this is how you're going to go about doing it, and then the shapes are secondary to that, in other words, what you look like is secondary to that, then it'd be much more effective in application. And, the sad truth is that a lot of people don't understand is that when we hit stress and pressure of a real environment, we become gross motor, we resort to gross motor movement. So that basically means all the fine motor skills that we learn because of stress and anxiety is actually eroded really through, the adrenal dump and so on. So, a strategy and an approach is much more applicable under a high stress environment than it would be if you were trying to. And that's why I can teach people of different, I was in Boston a few months ago. I was teaching there and I taught a seminar. Nice. And it was a mixed range of people. It was guys that were jiu-jitsu guys. There were guys that were from Thai boxing. There was guys that were, and we did a self-defense seminar. But I gave them concepts and ideas that everybody could relate to. And the first one was, okay, why are you here? Well, I want to learn how to defend myself. Okay, great. So how do most attacks happen? Why do most attacks happen? Everybody thought for a minute, and then I said to them, well, think about it. Most fights start, and I'm talking about fights, not attacks. There's a difference between the two, and I'll allude to that in a minute, from conversations, from arguments, because I don't know, the guy steps on your shoe or parks in your car spot, or you get road rage, you get out your car, the guy's screaming and shouting at you, or, there's something that precludes the attack. So in other words, it's often in conversational range. It's close. So, we went through the strategy of dealing, controlling space and understanding that, which is, beyond this. But the point was, it's something that is universally human. It's a human behavior. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. If someone's arguing with you, they will be in your face, argument, unless they're doing it over the phone, which is, that's cool.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry then.
Not yet, at least.
Not yet. But the point of what I'm trying to say is most attacks come from verbal confrontations, and confrontations are often going to be close. And a lot of people, they don't quite understand the intensity of violence and the closeness of that violence, and that leads to that. Again, I mean, that's different from assault, obviously, because assaults can be unprovoked. It could be a surprise. You could be walking down the road and someone jumps you from behind. But that's very, very different because the person's ambushing you. Yeah. And that is a different category of dealing with attacks and assaults. And frankly, again, if you were learning a specific martial arts, and I say much more of a traditional type of approach to training, you may come a cropper because, frankly, if you're worried about doing tiger fist or monkey claw and someone jumps you from behind and puts a bat in the back of your head to rob you, because that's often how people will rob you. They'll assault you first, and then they'll empty your pockets. Then we're all human. We're all going to be. Even I would struggle with that. So that's when you start talking about wider. And you teach Krav Maga, so you know this, the situational awareness and being aware of environment and so on. These are all, I think, areas that in traditional martial arts are lacking. But they're lacking not necessarily because the individuals don't know it, but because I think people go to a Kung Fu style because they want to learn Kung Fu, not necessarily because they want to learn, the reality of self-defense. If they did, they'd go to reality self-defense, or they'd do Krav Maga, or something that's what's on the box. But one of the things I try to do with what I do is I try to get the balance of the two. I look at it as, for me, a martial art has a value, has a social value. It's much more than just kicking and punching. It also has a cultural value, depending on whether you're learning a Japanese martial arts, Chinese martial arts, even an Indian martial art, because there are Indian martial arts. Depending on where you are, or even a Filipino martial art. Depending on where you are and the martial art you're learning, there's also a culture to it and a way of thinking. I like that aspect of what I do. I really do, because I think we become, as you said earlier, better versions of ourselves. So I like the fact that I teach people how to defend themselves, but at the same time, that I'm also teaching them how a wider way of thinking, if you like, a wider mindset, a cultural mindset. And, to me, that's a positive thing. So it's not all crash, bang, wallet, but that's what I like to do.
And it's huge, because it connects with a lot of people. And I think the way that one of the reasons why I asked you to do this interview is because I really believe that the way that you approach people, the one-to-one connection that you try to seem to establish, even just with the way that you talk through videos. Like whenever I watch your videos, I never feel like I'm just watching something. I almost feel like you're right there. And I almost feel like you're right there talking to either me or like a group of us, but it doesn't feel like, you're on the other side of the world as we have this interview right now. Watching your videos never makes me feel that way. That's why I wanted to reach out. And that's why, even though we're talking for the first time, for those of you guys that don't know, this is my first time talking to Sifu Mark. But talking to him, I feel like I've known you for I don't know how many months now. And it's because I've been watching you progressively as you deliver those videos. And it's always the same type of delivery, right? It's always talking about being able to adjust and adapt. And it's always talking about like your body structure, like what you can do. And, you always say it in your other videos, like somebody who's this big is not going to do the exact same thing as somebody who's this big. And you got to be aware of that, right? So one of the things that I don't know if it's over there, I know it happens here, maybe you get it too. We're starting to get more ladies that are looking into the self-defense side versus just the fitness side, even though that's obviously got its benefits. There's seemingly more violence that's happening out here in Canada. And one of the common things I get is, if a woman comes in, she's like, hey, I'm a female, I've never done this before. How am I gonna do this? Like, what can I expect? If a woman was to walk into your program, which I'm sure they do, what kind of outline? And I know that's a very general question, but as best you can, what kind of outline, what kind of expectation do you think you would share with them when they come in?
I try to keep it as balanced as possible, because sometimes when you go to the other extreme and you highlight the fact that they're a lady, they can be sometimes quite it can be a little bit more of a worry for them, basically. So I try to sort of ignore that factor. That sounds very strange, although women have different requirements. And I always explain to them, and that's on initial contact, but as time goes on, what I will explain probably after the second, maybe third or fourth lesson within the group, and I'll say this openly to the group so that the men are present as well. I always indicate that women will defend themselves for very different reasons than a man do. And a simple answer is that men fight out of ego, generally. I don't know the crime stats for you in Canada, but they're roughly the same in most countries. Over here, between 14 and I think it's changed, 24 is roughly the age group where you get a lot of male-on-male violence. Now, why is it? Why is that the case? Well, it's an ego period of our lives.
Too much testosterone. I got it. Yeah.
Much too much. And it's quite common, obviously. Yeah. Sometimes it spirals into crime, but generally it spirals into petty fighting, because it's very often ego driven. Because why do you have a fight with a guy? Well, because he's looking at you. Well, yeah, people look at you. You don't have to punch the face in because of that. There's a lot of reasons why young men fight.
Yeah.
And those reasons frankly, are avoidable. You can walk away from it. Now, for ladies, it's very different. Having said that, the culture, I don't know in Canada, but the culture here for young women is changing a little bit. Women are starting to become a little bit more sort of violent in terms of, especially the younger generation, a little bit more violent in terms of ego-driven violence. But as a rule, as a tendency, women defend themselves or are put in situations where they're being attacked more often by men. And then you've got to say there's much more sinister reasons for that. So I always emphasize that. That's my angle when I'm teaching. So my angle really generally teaching female students is quite often to emphasize the fact that they have a different consideration and therefore I have a different responsibility in teaching them to defend themselves because they are really going to be fighting someone if they have bad intentions, a man attacking a woman, that is, from a disadvantage. They're likely to be ambushed. They're likely to be put in a situation where it's going to be difficult for them to fight back and respond. So that being the case, that's usually the angle that I take, but I don't spell it out because, quite frankly, most ladies will be quite uncomfortable with that, especially on the first meeting. So it's something I usually let them get used to being in my environment, and then as time goes on, I emphasize the difference. So basically, there is a slight gender bias or separation in how men and ladies are taught. For example, I will teach the guys how to punch and I'll teach the ladies how to punch as well, but then I also teach them how to use open hand strikes. So how to use their fingers, how to use their thumbs, how to strike open hand to the windpipe and so on. So they use, the guys learn it as well, but the emphasis, and you've also got to look at the emphasis from reasonable force will be different. I mean, for a lady, it's much more reasonable to escalate to weapons such as open hands, to elbows and so on. For a guy who's having an altercation over a spilt drink, it wouldn't be reasonable to go in and chop the guy in the throat and crush his windpipe.
Hard to explain in court, right?
Yes,
yeah,
very much. It's just reasonable at all.
Not going to work. Yeah, most likely.
It's not going to work. So I have that again, and it's a moral responsibility. You've got to teach people because you expect that they may have to use it, and you have to be able to stand by what you teach them. So I get the balance right. I think I do anyway, but I do emphasize the difference in the genders.
I believe it. Yeah, no, a lot. Yeah, but your explanations, if they're just the same or pretty similar on video as they are in your classes, I'm sure that there's a lot of people nodding their heads, understanding what you're trying to share. So it's great. Can you share with us maybe a little, because I know we're coming close to end time over here. Maybe share with us a story. Can you tell us a story about how you being involved in this, either for yourself or for one of your students? Maybe they got into some sort of heated situation or some argument, or were they actually ambushed? Would you be able to share a story where by training it helped them either alleviate the situation, get out of it, or defend themselves? Something that actually it illustrates the value on a physical level for Wing Chun.
I will say, I mean, I get this a lot, ironically, on our YouTube channel. And as I alluded to earlier, I do teach from experience. One of the things I don't do, and I know, maybe I'll give some examples, but one of the things I don't do is talk about fights or situations that I've had, only because I find it quite crass and then unnecessary. But unfortunately, the younger YouTube generation have to go with, well, have you ever done that? And blah, blah, blah. You clearly, I had someone say the other day on a comment, you've clearly never had a fight in your life. And I thought,
oh, wow.
Okay.
They said that to you?
Yeah, they said it. I just had to roll my eyes and think, okay, I'll just make this up. I live with the fairies, and
makes you want to scratch your head a few times over, right?
Sometimes bang my head on the, the desk is sometimes what I'm past that stage now. But I will say, look, I teach from experience. I really do. And I've been fortunate and unfortunate enough to have a number of different experiences which have allowed me to see the way that I teach martial arts in a way that has to be adapted. And I think that's probably why I'm at where I am now. For example, I've worked in a number of different industries as well, but high risk as well. And when you start to see human behavior and you start to understand the way that people, how violence really works, you start to delineate basically what works and what doesn't work and how you present that information. Mm-hmm. But I will say that, one of the things I think I've been fortunate and lucky enough is that when I was younger, for probably the first 10 or 15 years of my career, I trained full time. And when I say that to people, they just don't get it. And I've been interviewed quite a few times, and I've often mentioned this because I think it's quite unique from my personal experience, and you don't often get it nowadays in the present. I mean, I used to train every day. Basically, I think I trained about 5-6 days a week, depending on rest periods. Now, modern fighters, what they do. I mean, I've got a couple of guys that just competed in MMA, which I said to you that was pretty good.
I hope they won.
They did quite. Yeah, well, one lost by decision, split decision. So there was no shame in that.
Not at all.
It was just basically, it came down to tactics. It was a very, very close fight, but It really came down to tactics and, and that's what it was, because, competitive fighting is down to game plan and a lot of other factors that go behind it, such as the weight cutting, the strategy. A lot of people, when they watch it on TV, they don't get it. They think, just two guys go in and, but there's a whole sort of 6-week fight camp that we did prior to that where my guys were working. I mean, one guy won, one of my fighters won in the first 15 seconds. He basically won by TKO, 15 seconds.
Nice.
Ran and pound the guy down, and the other one went to split decision. But even when I was training my guys, they did a 6-week fight camp, and they trained much less like I did. They did 3 sessions a day. They worked quite hard for it. But I was doing that for a 10-15 year period. So
it's a long time.
10-15 is a long time. I was training that way, but I was training that way, practically daily, but I was doing 3 sessions a day plus teaching. Mm-hmm. So if you really fully immerse and dedicate yourself to it, then you can achieve that ability. Mm-hmm. And I think that itself is the main distinction, I would say, between what I bring to the table now, because that's a lot of experience in not only training but obviously application as well, because we used to train for events and what have you, but I will say that I don't make things up, and I certainly don't teach from the fact that my Sifu said to me, block a punch like this, therefore I block a punch like that. What I do is I teach from what I've experienced and what I've found that works and what doesn't work. And if something doesn't work, I'll be quite honest and I'll say this doesn't work, or it hasn't worked for me. And it may not work for me, not necessarily because it doesn't work, it just doesn't suit me, or I'm just not good enough, or I don't understand it. I'm able to also embrace my own weaknesses, and I'm humble enough to understand that I don't know everything, and really at the end of the day, I can't claim to be the best at everything, and I don't. I just, that's why I embrace the comments on our YouTube channel, but sometimes they are frustrating, but I embrace them because I think, I might actually learn something myself. But I'm surprised the amount of people that don't have the same attitude. They come at it as, they come at it as, how should I put it? There's nothing to be learned from the material. And I think that's quite sad, because to me, it doesn't matter what martial art you do, where you come from, what your background is, even how old you are. If you've got something to offer and you've got some experience, then it's worth listening to. And I'm very eclectic in the way that I do and practice my Wing Chun. Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing I'm not sure if you're aware, that Wing Chun community is steeped by lineage. And it's a bit like universities, really. Someone will say, I went to Oxford University, and someone will say, I went to Cambridge University, and someone will say, I went to Thames Valley University, which is a great university. But the point is, you're judged by so it's a lineage thing. But the problem is, the guys with the most pedigree lineages are the ones that live on the reputations of others. Yeah. They're the ones that actually don't go out there and test it, and those are the ones that have never really done anything or never had a fight, or never actually even sparred and put the
Yeah.
gloves on or even been hit, because what they do is they rely on the fact that their teacher told them that this works, and therefore they're going to go on with that. But the problem is they then start opening schools and start teaching, and then they start teaching the same thing to other people. And to me, that's reprehensible. I'm quite passionate about certain things, but one of the things I'm certainly passionate about is people that do that, because you're leading people astray and you're potentially teaching someone something that is going to get them hurt if they really don't know what they're doing. When I teach my students, I prepare them physically and mentally. And we have not a tough regime. You can take out of it what you want, but we do separate fitness conditioning classes. We do what we call sandar classes, which are basically gloved-based heavy sparring classes. We obviously teach Wing Chun, and those are segregated into levels, and each level has its own focus. Beginners tend to focus much more on the basic foundations and self-defense. The intermediates tend to focus much more on the art, the traditional aspects of the art, and the advanced tend to look at this idea of applying the style in a fighting context. Because I have a very simple theory, and you may have heard it in one of my, not a theory, but an analogy or approach. I look at what I do as teaching people self-defense, teaching people how to fight, and teaching people a martial art. And for me, there are three different things. A martial art is not the same as fighting. Fighting is not the same as self-defense. Self-defense is not the same. They're all completely different. And what people do is they lump them into the same category. They assume that if I'm learning a martial art, I'm learning self-defense or I'm learning how to fight. Well, frankly...
What is that difference anyway? Because I get that. And I've heard that on some other occasions, but it's rare for me to meet somebody like you that actually says, you know what, it's good to look at it from three different perspectives, almost like three different entities. If somebody was new to this and they're like, I don't get it, how would you explain that?
Simple. If I'm learning self-defense, I'm learning to defend myself against someone that doesn't know how to fight. Joe Bloggs, who's getting in my face, who's screaming and shouting at me, he's having a bad day. He's not a fighter. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's just wants to have a go at me, maybe because I bumped into him in the subway, or I stepped in front of him in a queue and I didn't know he was in the queue. I spilled his drink, or whatever the reason is. That's self-defense, but that could also be in the same category, me walking down the road and a guy jumping out from ambushing me and trying to rob or assault me. That's self-defense. That's all in the same category. Fighting's the other extreme. Fighting is where I'm engaging in a fight with someone that knows how to fight. So, and the variables are very different. It could be, for example, it could even be an arranged fight. It could be a challenge fight between two martial artists. It could be an MMA fight. It could be a boxing match, whatever it is. It could even be a sparring match, a heavy sparring match. But it's something I'm willingly entering into, and I know what's happening, and I'm facing someone who has an equal amount of skill that I have. That's a fight. Whereas a martial art is very different to the other two, because I'm learning the esoteric nature of what I'm doing. It's much more about the shapes, the thinking, the culture, the wider envelope of it. And so it would be hierarchical to me. I would look at it as initially the pinnacle is learning how to fight. The basics are really learning how to defend yourself. So if it was a hierarchical pyramid of needs, then the middle of it would be learning a martial art. So you could even say it's the other way around, and martial arts is like self-actualization, because it has really not much to do with fighting. But fighting is a completely different kettle of fish. And if I was to say to you, look, people say to me quite often, I want to learn how to defend myself. This is going off tangent slightly, but it is relevant. And I'll say to them, defend yourself against what? And you'd be really surprised how many looks I get. People will look at me and they'll say, I want to learn self-defense. And I'll say, yeah, but what type of self-defense? What do you mean by self-defense? Are you worried about you lying in your bed at night and someone climbing through your window? And, we call it aggravated burglary here. It's obviously a criminal offence, but I don't know what the charge is in Canada. But, and that's a serious offence to someone to break into your house when you're there, especially if they know you're there. Carjacking, you're in your car and someone tries to take your car off of you. or assault you to take your car. What do you mean by self-defense? That's very different to you standing in a bus queue and someone just sounding off at you because they're upset over, they're having a bad day. That's very different. So I do categorize it, and I think, for example, martial arts are generally self-categorized by those definitions in themselves. So, for example, some people might shout me down for this, but I actually would put boxing and MMA and those, very hands-on arts into the category of fighting, because you're really learning how to fight someone who's got equal amount of skills, timing, cadence, footwork, distance, an eclectic ability of skills, being able to punch and kick, equal possibly to you. And that's very different, as I said, to if you're learning self-defense, because if I'm learning how to box, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be any better off if I was sitting in my car and someone tried to drag me out of my car by my hair and punch my face in and take my car. Mm-hmm. Boxing's not going to be applicable to that. Or I'm walking down the road and suddenly someone comes up behind me and puts a bottle over the back of my head and tries to pull my wallet out of my back of my pocket. Again, that's not the same as me facing off someone against the opposite side of the ring and walking to the center to fight them. That's different. So, I really am also very passionate about making that distinction when I explain. And if you look at the videos on our YouTube channel, they're really sort of divided between fighting, martial arts, and self-defense. And there are three sort of themes within the work that I do, and each of them will be very different. So it's something I am quite passionate about it, because, as I said, I do feel that I have a responsibility to the people that I teach, and it's really important that I stick to that, really, because otherwise you become a charlatan, I suppose, and that's something I'm not going to be.
Yeah, no, that clearly you've got way too much passion in what you do and too much drive and belief to ever be close to a charlatan. They just generally care about one thing, and that's usually just getting from other people. But obviously, I mean, we've been at this for almost an hour, Sifu Mark, and your energy from moment now, like a 51 minutes in, is the same from 1 minute in. Like when we get on a topic, like you can eat that thing up. I'm like, wow, I wish I had notes on me right now because I can't even remember all this. But that's a great sign, because you're sharing something that you really believe in. And I think that's so important as a teacher, because sometimes if we're just regurgitating information, it's not the same. It doesn't hit home the same for people as when you're talking from experience, when you're talking about belief, when you're talking about like, this is how it's turned my life around some way, somehow. Like even for me, like how I got involved in self-defense is because I got beat up. I got beat up horribly and brutally. And as a guy, when we get beat up, like, we can swallow our pride sometimes and be like, okay, you know what? I should have been better. But to look over and see that my friend got beat up too, and they were in the hospital with me, and to have to live that and be reminded of that every day, something else comes out of us when we realize, okay, this has to make an impact on my life. And I feel like that's the kind of guy you are. So it's such a blessing to have you. And I know I keep complimenting you on that. It's just, I got to tell you, I don't always come across trainers that are willing to be so expressive and open. So I really appreciate you doing that. And I think absolutely. It leads me to my last question for the day that is a little off on a tangent. It's a little off the side, but I hope it's a comfortable one to share. I always like to ask inspiring people, if 100 years from now, that was today, and I believe you're going to live a long time because you're obviously a very healthy guy. If today was your last day and you passed away, what would you want to be remembered for? Of all the many things that you could be remembered for, what's the one thing that you would want to leave imprinted on the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are going to get a chance to know your name and hear your voice?
Well, I mean, from a personal perspective, I mean, obviously I'm a family man, so I would always, want my children and my family to remember me for, being the good fun spirit that I was. But for my students, I would want them to remember me as someone that cared. And I don't mean that in a sort of, what I mean in the sense that That's a good question, actually. No one's ever. I've done a lot of interviews, never had that question. So you've really caught me off on the hop on that. No, but it is a really good question. I suppose I'm an honest person, and I teach in an honest fashion, and I want to be remembered for my sincerity, I suppose. And I think people that have spent a lot of time. I have some guys that have been with me. I have a guy that's been with me for 22 years, I think, or nearly 20 years, and that's a long time. And I joked earlier when I said, I've been with my own teacher. I mean, he's my mentor, really, basically, for 32 years. I mean, obviously, I don't train in a class anymore because I stand on my own 2 feet, and teaching is a little bit like parenting. Some people are good parents and some people are bad parents. They're good in the sense that you bring your children up and prepare them for life to be independent and to go out there and to not to lean on you, I suppose. And I think any parent listening to this podcast would understand what I'm saying. You don't bring your children up to be completely dependent on you for the rest of your life, because that's not what we do. We bring them up to be not only to be better people, but and even better carnations of ourselves, but to be independent, to be able to be self-sufficient. And I was teaching my students recently, and I'll say something to you that I could have gone in and just told him what he was doing wrong, but I gave him a whole lot of information and I explained to him why. And then I looked at him and I said to him, do you understand why I'm doing this? Because I could have just said to him, this is what you're doing, do it like this. But I told him the whys and the whats. And he looked at me and he didn't really understand the question. And I said to him, and it's a saying that many people have heard, I said, it's far better for me to teach you how to fish than to give you fish. And the point is that I could put his arms and legs in the right position, but if I really taught him how to understand what he was doing, he could progress and improve well beyond ever being with me. In other words, he could leave my tutelage and my mentoring and go on and become his own person and still improve as a martial artist or as a fighter or as a self-defense expert or whatever the focus is, because I've implanted that mindset, that strategy that will be with him for the rest of his life, as opposed to actually having him dependent on me, feeding my ego, which is often what happens because you have people that are dependent on you. And that's what I would want to be remembered for, just the person that has inspired people to go forward and create better things. And, if my students go on to be better than me and be more successful for me, then that's what I would want. So I wouldn't want anything other than that, because that means, like a good parent, and I don't get me wrong, when I use the parent analogy, I don't, I'm not going to the other extreme, because these are all grown adults that you have. But I think that's what I want to be remembered for, to be the person that inspired people to go further than they could do, and to be a better them, I suppose. And that's really where I would be from. And I try to do that in my personal life with my family, but there's a different context, obviously, with children. But certainly with my students, I take it seriously. I don't treat them as numbers, and I certainly don't treat them as, I don't teach for money, to be honest with you. I teach because I love and enjoy what I do. I'm blessed. I really am blessed to be fortunate enough to be, asked to visit different countries and different places. And I think it's because I'm just quite open with my information. I don't believe in secrets. I really don't believe in secrets. I just think, information's there to be shared. And even if I tell you something, you still got to be able to use it and apply it and embrace it. And if you can do that and extend it, and you can extend it further than I can, then great. Tell me how you did that, and maybe I can learn from you too. It's an attitude that I think is sadly missing in martial arts generally. But But then, that's another podcast for another day and another hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Some great shares that you brought up. And I think I really like how you just brought up the concept of being remembered as somebody that cared. I mean, it sounds so simple, and if some people might look at it as like being simplistic, but I find for our kind of work, like this is more than just, as some people would say, making money. This is more than just about fitness. This is more than just about self-defense. Like we're almost being held, maybe for lack of a better term, we're being held accountable and responsible for helping mold people into living better, to living more confidently, to having more access to good things in their life, which sometimes requires being able to get over, get through, get around the hard times, and instead of just eating the punch to the face per se. So the way that you're able to articulate your information and come from a place where you actually give a shit about people. I mean, sorry for the French, but I've just seen, just like what you said on so many occasions. Some people will just regurgitate information. Some people will do it just for the money, and some people do it because they genuinely care. Obviously, we have to pay our bills too. There's no question to that. But there's that fine balance between, well, I got to make my money to live, and I want to share what I have because I genuinely care about you, student X. Like, you're not just somebody that signs me a paycheck every month. You're someone who I want to see live a better life. And I feel like you come from that place where you're well balanced like that. And that's a rarity around here. There's a lot of great instructors, and no disrespect to anybody out there watching this that teach. I got respect for everybody out there that does their thing. I also have an extra special place in myself because I haven't been as fortunate to always meet people that come from that place of being well balanced, both emotionally, mentally, and being so open to want to freely share their advice. So I'm thankful that you and I had a chance to meet today, that you've been so open and willing to share so much about yourself. I know that there's at least a big handful of people on my side that are watching this video right now that will want to reach out to you, maybe get a chance to visit your school when they go out to London, England. Did you want to close off maybe with some contact details, your website maybe, so they can reach out to you?
Of course. Yeah, I mean, we are absolutely welcome. I mean, we do welcome visitors. In fact, sometimes we'll get people. On one occasion, we had about 3 people from 3 different countries turn up on the same day, which was great. There was someone from Paris, I think, someone from New York, and someone from Singapore all on the same day. It was really cool.
That is cool.
We get that quite often. So we do, and we literally have a drop-in session. In other words, if you're in town, just send me a message. I'm on Facebook, or you can contact us via our website, which is londonwingchun.co.uk. But if you reach out to me, even through our YouTube channel, which is obviously YouTube/London Wing Chun, we're also going under the name as Bite Science. Actually, that's so if you search for that. But if you message us, we're always welcome. We always welcome new people just to come in, and sometimes, I genuinely do this. There's people sometimes come down, and we'll go for a coffee, and I do that actually. I don't just say it; we actually do it. But most of the time, people come down, and I sit. They don't even have to train; they just sometimes come down and just chat to me. It happens quite often. I'm quite used to it now because we're in London, and London's a capital city, and we're quite accessible as well. We're on Zone 3. We're in Wood Green, which is the nearest tube station. So we get a lot of visitors, but I actually enjoy it. I really like it because it gives me a chance to. I'm very cosmopolitan. I like to meet different people, and that's why I like to travel. So when I get invited to go to different countries, I genuinely go because it's actually the opportunity to just be in a new environment, meet new people, have different discussions about what they do. It's a new sort of form of enthusiasm. So people often come to see us, and sometimes they'll come and take a class. And as I said, sometimes they'll just come down just for a chat and just sort of introduce themselves and tell me about tell me their stories. And I generally do make time to speak to people. So if you're in town, just give me a shout, and if you want to come and see what we do, you're perfectly welcome to do that. And we're quite friendly as well, so it's not the case you're going to turn up and we're suddenly going to ambush you with the ninjas and so on. It'll be it's all good, it's all cool.
That's only for your advanced students, I bet, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they had to walk the fire line.
There you go. Fantastic. Guys, thanks so much for listening in. This has been a great session with Sifu Mark. If you got any questions, please make sure you reach out to him. Or if you're watching over on my side, just check out www.tacticalpersonalprotection.com. I'll have this posted on our website in the next few days. Once again, Sifu Mark, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.